Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar organized by the European Disability Forum. I hope that everyone is well, and I thank you very much for taking the time to attend this webinar with us today. Today, we will be talking about disability assessment, the process by which people are assessed to be declared as having a disability, and crucially, to be made eligible to receive support that comes with this official recognition. Before we begin today, I would just like to share with you some logistical information and some housekeeping rules for how this webinar will work. The first thing to mention is that we have real-time captioning. You can find the link to this in the chat box, which should be to the right of your screen. As some of you will have noticed, we also have international sign language interpretation for you. I should also point out that your microphones as participants are muted, and EDF controls the permission to unmute these. So if you're trying to unmute and you can't, this is entirely normal. In case you have any technical issues, you can write to my colleague Raquel using the chat box, and she will try to resolve your problem as soon as possible. We would also invite you to ask questions throughout the webinar, so you can do this at any time. There is a question box, which is just a little bit below the chat box. We will do our best to leave time at the end to answer all of these questions. We would ask that when you send a question, please specify to which speaker you would like to ask the question. And if you want to see the program for today, you can go to the handout tab and you can find the program with all of the speakers there. Before we start, I want to thank our interpreters, Ferdinand and Lisa, and our live captioner, Kimberly. I would also, of course, like to thank the speakers for being with us, and of course, all of you for taking the time to join us today. Okay, so my name is Hayden Hammersley. I am the Social Policy Officer at the European Disability Forum, and I will be your moderator for today. As mentioned at the beginning, we will be discussing disability assessment. So we will be looking at what the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities says about how this process can respect human rights. We will explore what different systems exist throughout the EU. We will be looking at some of the challenges that exist in getting a diagnosis and in getting the right kind of support afterwards. And then we will be taking a more detailed look at some of the systems, well, actually at the systems that exist in 2 of the member states, so in Cyprus and in Italy. We will be joined by 6 speakers today. Our first speaker will be Catalina Devandas, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We'll be joined by Mark Priestley, who's Professor of Disability Policy at the University of Leeds. We will be joined then by Gunta Anca. She is from the Latvian umbrella body for disability organizations, Sustento. We'll be joined by Nadia Haddad, who is from the European Network on Independent Living and is also an executive member of the European Disability Forum. We'll be joined by Konstantinas Charalambous, who's from the Department for Social Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities, the Ministry of Labour, Welfare and Social Insurance in Cyprus. And then finally, we will be joined by Giampiero Griffo from the Italian Disability Forum and also an EDF board member. Okay, so without any further ado, I would like to hand over to our first speaker, Catalina Devandas. Catalina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to join you all, and specifically with this distinguished list of speakers and panelists, all colleagues and good friends, and hello to all and to all the audience. And it's also a great opportunity to be discussing more in depth about the disability assessment process, because this is a key element that allows for the enjoyment of social protection for persons with disabilities. As you know, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities introduced a mandate on Article 28, an obligation to states to secure the access to persons with disabilities to social protection schemes, and the disability assessment, and particularly the whole determination and eligibility criteria and process, is a fundamental part of making sure that persons with disabilities can actually benefit from all the schemes and protections available for the whole population. It is important, though, to remember, and I believe to make a small clarification from the beginning, the assessment is part of a broader process, which is called the eligibility and determination process. And the assessment is one component of that process, which is which at the end is going to determine who is going to receive the benefits and what type of benefits, who is eligible to receive those benefits. But it is important to remember that to be in line and to make sure that social protection is achieved or is enjoyed by persons with disabilities, we have to look back at the convention and make sure that the processes, including the assessment, is in line with the convention, and that the main goal of this assessment or these processes should be to ensure the participation of persons with disabilities and their inclusion. And this is key, and the call for changing the way in which we have been doing things. That means separating ourselves from processes that were based only in the analysis of the impairment, based on a medical approach or based on a charity approach to disability, and instead look at what are the support needs that persons with disabilities require, but also what are the barriers around that are impeding their full participation. So what it's important to remember for us is, of course, that the process needs to be completely in line with the convention, that needs to be accessible, and that needs to be free, that we need to ensure gratuity, and also that needs to be focused on the person. But again, the process of eligibility and the determination that has these 3 steps, we have to remember that it's not only aimed at identifying those who need or require benefits or supports or protection or products, but it's also aimed at identifying barriers and how to eliminate those barriers so that we really promote opportunity, equal opportunity, accessibility, and inclusion of persons with disabilities. And I believe it's important to differentiate the 3 elements in the whole process. So the assessment is, what is the extent of the disability, what are the barriers to participation that we face, and what support is required. Then we have the disability determination, which is another step, basically, that establishes who legally, who is considered a person with a disability under a legal definition, on the relevant regulations, and under schemes or policies. And then you go to the eligibility, which is the stage in which you define which services, which benefits will be allocated, or the person will be entitled to which benefits because of the determination and the assessment that was made. So before, and we have witnessed that, we had an impairment approach to the assessment. We have a functional limitation approach to the assessment. So the first one was only looking at the severity of the impairment or the health condition. The functional approach or the functional limitation approach was assessing the functional limitation and basic activities. And then we're moving and we're aiming that with the convention, we're seeing a transition towards the disability approach, which will be assessing the interaction of the internal or individual factors, the impairment, the health condition, the functional limitations, and how they interact with the environment. But so how do we make sure that when doing that, and I will try to avoid overlapping because I know that many of you will be talking about this, but how do we ensure some basic alignment with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities when engaging in this process? The first step, that is the assessment, that is what is the recognition of the person conditions, the context, and the support needs that the person has. The first thing is, of course, we need to make sure that this process of assessment, this evaluation is done in is respectful of the rights of persons with disabilities. So while doing the assessment, of course, we have to respect the integrity of the person, the liberty of the person. The assessment has to be free of violence, for instance, and of course, not depriving persons with disabilities from the rights, including liberty or integrity. A second big aspect is participation and empowerment. That means that the participation in the assessment process is key. It has to be in accordance with what the person wants, and the person has to be involved meaningfully involved in all stages, but also that the process itself, it's aimed to promote participation. And I think that that's also important. It's not only how do we provide services or support to people, but how do we make sure that those services and support, it's aimed at fostering the participation of persons with disabilities. Another aspect is non-discrimination and equality. How do we guarantee that the outcome of the assessment does not result in discrimination against persons with disabilities? So for instance, again, it will result in the lack of participation of persons. And this is the example of assessments will result in excluding persons with disabilities from the workforce, or saying you will receive the pension only if you don't work, or to make a distinction between the type of assessment that is done for different impairment groups, which might also be discriminatory. We have to look at gender equality. We have to look at accessibility, which is always a must, to make sure that all stages of the process of the assessment are accessible, from the information on policy on how the access information about how to do the assessment, the process of the assessment. We've seen examples in which deaf people is convened to places where there's no sign language interpreter to do the assessment, or they cannot even communicate to open the door of the facility in which the assessment is undertaken. We have to respect the dignity, the confidentiality, and this is also important, of course, privacy and making sure that the data that we gather is duly managed, but also that the assessment is tailored to the objective. Although there might be very comprehensive assessments that are going to look at the whole conditions and challenges and barriers that a person faces and all their support needs, we also need to be mindful that it will not be proportional, for instance, to make a person go through a work capacity assessment when what the person is requesting is a parking permit, for instance. So how do we make sure that we tailor the assessment to the needs? And of course, we need to have the existence of an appeal process so that persons with disabilities can complain about the result or the mechanisms or the practice that we are taking to make the assessment. I'm sorry. So we also need, and this is just moving forward and to end, mindful of time, we need to make some considerations to make sure that in the future the processes of disability, eligibility, and determination are inclusive, or moving towards inclusive, and this is more policy oriented. So we need to make sure that all the information and all the packages and the schemes and the benefits that are available, both the mainstream benefits and the specific benefits and a broader social protection scheme, are accessible, and persons with disabilities could opt to benefit from those processes. We need to make sure that the assessment is reliable. So it is important that the process is fair, that it's unbiased, that we can actually transparently communicate and inform about the process. And we need to have better training of those that are making the assessment to guarantee that this process is going to be unbiased. I also want to alert about some uses that we have seen of the disability assessment and what the disability assessment should not be. It should not be used, for instance, for design universal policy and legislation, because these policies should target everybody, and it should not be based on a particular assessment of the situation. So there's no need to use a disability and eligibility determination process during the development of any universal policy of legislation, and this sometimes is the case. Also, it's important that the disability assessment should not be used, or in any case, the broader eligibility and determination process to collect data or to establish the prevalence of data estimates. This has been a worrisome trend that we have seen in some countries which use their assessment as the main criteria for data collection, and demographics, actually mixing demographics with administrative data, which is very worrisome. And of course, and I repeat this, that at the end of the assessment process, what we want to see is a process that foster the participation and inclusion of persons with disabilities, and thus the result of the assessment, not only the assessment cannot be depriving rights, so the process has to be respectful of the rights of persons with disabilities, but also that the end, when you the outcome of the assessment is not going to result in the deprivation of rights of persons with disabilities. So for instance, that as a result of the assessment, you have to go to a segregated education setting, or an institution, or another forms of segregation and violations of, or violations of the rights of persons with disabilities that will contravene the convention. So it's important to think about how to make sure that we comply with all of these parameters. And with that, I stop, and I thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you very much, Catalina, for this very comprehensive overview. I would like to remind the participants that you can, of course, submit your questions to all of the speakers in the questions box. So please, if you have something on your mind or something you think wasn't clear, make sure you send in that question. So to build on this first presentation, we will now hand over to Mark Priestley from the University of Leeds. So without any further ado, I'll give you the floor, Mark. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hayden. And thank you very much for the invitation. Catalina has given us a really good overview, which helps to make our presentation a little bit easier, but we will end up very much in the same place. Some of the key messages that we want to articulate are very similar, which I think is a good thing. This summary comes out of work that we did for the Academic Network of European Disability Experts a couple of years ago, a work task which was led by my colleague, Professor Lisa Waddington from Maastricht. And it's summarizing some of the key points from the synthesis report that appears on the ARNED website, and we'll be able to provide a link for that. And we've been revisiting some of that work and trying to draw out some of the kind of key messages and looking back at that in relation to the CRPD, and particularly to the comments of the United Nations Committee. And so I'll be looking at that. Okay. So as Catalina has said, these assessments of disability status are really important in welfare states because they provide people with access to public systems of help and support. So that can be help in cash or services in kind. That's where we're most familiar with seeing disability assessments. And I'm not going to talk about the rules of eligibility, determination, but really about the assessment process. So what we tried to do was to look at 35 European countries and to try and look at the methods of assessment that were being used and how they differed from one country to another. And what we're doing here is to try and relate that back to the convention. So if we were to look at the different types of methods, there are at least 5 or 6 different broad approaches to assessment that are used in states. So at the simplest level, and what we might call a kind of medical approach, you can just use diagnosis of a specific impairment or a condition to qualify as in terms of disability. So, for example, in some of the Lithuanian legislation, you might find a list of qualifying conditions or medical diagnoses, and everyone with that condition would be judged to be disabled, if you like. Irrespective of the differences between people who might have the same diagnosis but very different experiences. A second type of assessment, what we call a barometer or a scale, measurement scale, and many people be familiar in European countries with the idea of being 10% disabled or 33% disabled or 66% disabled. This idea of a kind of measured scale. And again, the difficulty with that kind of arbitrary measure is it does not take account of the circumstances in which the person finds themselves. So somebody might feel more disabled or restricted in say, at work or at home, but there is a fixed scale which applies to them wholly as a person. The third method that we're very familiar with is the idea of functional capacity. Can you walk upstairs? Can you lift an object? Can you stand? Can you walk 50 meters? And again, the difficulty there is sometimes that the functionality of the person is measured without any reference to the barriers that they face, as Catalina identified. A fourth type of assessment would be rather different. It would be an assessment of needs rather than an arbitrary sort of measurement. So the most familiar one is, how many hours of practical assistance, personal assistance does somebody need? And one person might need 12 hours, somebody else might need 30 hours. But based on needs. And a kind of subcategory of that would be an assessment of economic loss, which we can think of as a different type of assessment. For some benefit systems, there are standardized rates of cash benefit that are awarded to people after an assessment. But there are some cases where the assessment actually takes account of the amount of economic loss that's specific to a particular person. So how much does it cost to take a taxi to work, and can we remunerate that? That's very different to giving somebody a benefit which is based on a flat rate. So there would be an assessment of economic loss. And the final type, what we've called a procedural approach, is often a kind of mixture of methods that take place over a time through a process. So, for example, in the Danish employment rehabilitation system, where a person might go through a long, sustained process of exploring options in the employment system, but before any determination is reached over a period of months, sometimes. But all of that process or procedure is part of an assessment. Okay, so different types. The difficulty with this is that this variation and the lack of recognition between states of different methods presents some barriers to freedom of movement. And that's a problem we can return to. Okay, so over the past years, there have been several drivers of change to the way that we do disability assessments. And 3 that we want to highlight. There are budget constraints during a period of austerity. We've seen as welfare costs have risen that member states have sometimes tried to change their methods of assessment or the eligibility criteria to make disability benefits harder to get. We've seen technical developments, particularly the international classification of functioning and the language involved in defining disability. And we've seen the CRPD, and it's really that we want to focus on. Without going through the whole thing, Catalina pointed to the key issue, which is that the CRPD concept of disability is a relational one. It's about an interaction between people who have impairments and barriers to participation. And so really an assessment of disability ought to take account of both sides of this equation about a person in interaction with an environment. And therefore an arbitrary assessment without reference to barriers seems difficult to fit with the CRPD model. So assessments should be personalised, but their main focus should be on barriers, and the interaction with barriers. And the CRPD doesn't tell us how assessments should be done, but the committee has given us quite a lot of advice and recommendation to different states over the years. And mainly European countries have been criticised, different countries, for adopting a medicalised approach, a deficiency model of functioning or capacity, for focusing too much on people's impairments, skills and capabilities rather than on barriers, using diagnostic criteria that exclude some categories of persons rather than others, particularly people with psychosocial or intellectual impairments, and failing to establish appropriate definitions of disability in legislation, which kind of underpin the welfare system. But we've also seen criticisms that criteria are not applied consistently, either between different policy functions or between the national level and the local level. So we looked at examples of promising practices across many countries, and we reached a number of kind of conclusions. We suggest really that public authorities need to base the design of disability assessments on social model and human rights approaches to disability, that they need to consult with and involve disabled people's organisations in the design and review of these assessment systems, that it may be important to involve multidisciplinary expertise in a disability assessment system rather than relying on a single disciplinary knowledge base, for example, medicine. And providing accessible information, as we've already heard, the participation of disabled people, and trying to reduce the administrative burden on applicants and people who are navigating their way through complicated assessments. And one of the difficulties here is trying to eliminate duplication in assessments where people might go through very much similar types of assessments in the same member state for different functions. On the one hand, but on the other hand, making sure, as Catalina said, that the assessments are tailored to the policy function. So finally, we concluded with a set of kind of 12 principles, which are really, I'll just read them out. So the first one is that the design and the conduct of disability assessment should be guided by the same principles, general principles that animate the CRPD, non-discrimination and so on. And the rights that are enshrined in the CRPD apply to assessment systems at the local and the regional level, as well as those carried out by national governments. So some kind of consistent frame for that. They need to take into account the interactions between persons and barriers. That really is crucial, I think. That an assessment of somebody's functioning with no reference to the workplace is not a very effective assessment of somebody's ability to work. The assessment needs to be conducted in a way that's accessible in accordance with Article 9. It needs to recognise the legal capacity of people to participate on an equal basis in the assessment process, to voice and be part of decision making. The process of the assessment or its outcome should not deprive people of their liberty. So, for example, detaining people in assessment centres arbitrarily is problematic. It shouldn't subject people to cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. It seems obvious, but many assessment processes appear to do that and cause great distress. A social needs assessment needs to begin from respect for the right to live independently and be included in the community. So when we talk about needs, it needs to start from that basis. And across a range of policy functions, the eligibility criteria need to be framed in relation to specific elements of the convention. So if it's in relation to employment, it needs to consider Article 27 and so on. And the last couple, the provisions for review and the appeal of the assessment decisions, as well as the conduct of the assessment process, need to respect a person's right to access of justice. There needs to be good clear systems for contesting the results or the conclusions of disability assessments. Catalina has mentioned training, which we would also endorse, but particularly training professionals and staff who are involved in assessment in disability perspectives, in human rights perspectives. And finally, of course, there should be the involvement of disabled people and their organisations, as well as human rights bodies, in the review and the design of assessment, national disability assessment systems. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was very detailed. I think it's given us a lot of food for thought. I'm sure we'll have many questions from participants on that, so we will see that at the end. I'm now going to hand over to Gunther Anscha, who I should have mentioned before is also an executive member of EDF. And Gunther will be talking about disability assessment, but with more of a focus on some of the things that don't work very well in disability assessment. So I will hand over to you, Gunther.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me now? Great. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this very interesting webinar about disability assessment. And of course, it could be much more better to be in Zagreb at the moment and have a nice seminar there with many people around, but still we are here. We had a very, very interesting presentations of Catalina and Mark, and they gave me a fantastic framework for my speech, because I'm not going to speak on very high level. I'm not going to speak about political or theoretical issues, but much more I'm going to speak about very practical issues, what I've asked for. So what is the experience I have, my experience and experience of those countries I much more involved with. I'm much more involved with East European countries, and those East European countries more or less have the same history, especially those countries which are coming from the Soviet Union time. What is the situation in those countries even now? Maybe just in a few words, even Mark gives some kind of understanding how it's going on. In many countries, we still have three groups of disabilities, where the first one is the most severe group, and the third one is not so severe anymore. Those three groups, from one side, it's quite easy to understand how severe is the disability, but from other side, it makes a lot of differences, because all kind of support, all kind of services, and all kind of benefits is given by country is given according to the group. So it means everyone who has a first group can get a specific kind of pension, and it doesn't matter why the person has the first group. So it means there could be a person like me on a wheelchair, which need quite a lot of assistance, and there could be a person with some kidney problems, where they should go to dialyze once a week, but other times the person can do everything for themselves. But at the same time, all kind of support given by the country is at the same level, because only one criteria, disability group, is taken in account in order to give support for people. And it makes a lot of problems in a country, and many people are saying that the support is too small to them, and country is saying that they don't have the money, and of course nobody says that support is too high for them. Of course not. The other issue what Mark already talked is diagnosis, and diagnosis is a really big issue, because as you know, there could be a very different conditions of the people with the same diagnosis. Someone could be on a wheelchair, someone can go by the sticks, and someone can be this, you should get your disability. And it's still working in many East European countries. Even we are not saying that's so, but it's still so. So medical models are working really, really good at the moment, which is bad, and we try to do our best to change something. Medical model is coming from Soviet time, as I said, and maybe you know the story how the doctor
Gunther, I'm sorry, we're having a slight issue with your audio. Can you hear us? Gunther, I'm sorry, we have a slight issue with the audio. Can you hear us? In this case, what we might do, Gunther, if you can hear us, is we will come back to you at the end, and we will move on to Nadia. Okay, apologies. We had some slight technical issues. We will come back to Gunther later when if we can re-establish the connection. In the meantime, what we will do is we will hand over to the next speaker, who is Nadia Haddad from the European Network on Independent Living, and also who is an executive member of EDF. And Nadia will be giving an overview of the different disability assessment systems in place in the EU. Nadia, are you there?
Yes.
Yes. So what I'm going to do now is, because Nadia has a PowerPoint presentation, I will share my screen. So I'll turn off my camera.
Bye.
And now normally you can see my screen.
Okay.
Nadia, I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this important webinar. We have already heard a lot about different assessments, and I may repeat some of them, but I will first of all frame a little bit the results of the survey that the European Disability Forum has realized last year. It was in order to prepare the 4th edition of a human rights report, and it was to represent the true extent of how poverty and social inclusion affects persons with disabilities in the European Union. So for that purpose, they realized a survey, and today I will present you a little bit the outcomes of that survey that our members filled in, and their members also. Next slide, please. So I will repeat maybe what Mark already explained very well. The different type or models that are used to assess. So we still have in Europe the biblical approach that does not take into account the needs of the person that is assessed at all. Then we have the Barema method, and it's a kind of percentage of disability, like Mark said, and it's declared of the loss of ability in each body part. So if you lost an eye, they can say 40%, or if you have an amputation of a foot, they can say in one country 30%, and another country they can give you 66%. So it's especially about really percentage of disability. And in some countries, if you have an impairment on one of your members, they automatically say, for example, you have 66% plus. What it really means in reality stays very vague, and that's the Barema model. Next slide, please. What we also saw that still the functional capacity assessment is used, and this one seeks to establish the functional limitation, but it involves identifying the abilities and inabilities for the individual. So here's a positive part that it trying to see what's the person still able to do. And then we have finally and happily the holistic approach that is still used. And this type of assessment really is related to the impairment, the functional capacity, and the environmental factors. And that is the one was most aligned with the CRPD, and it also it helps in a successful implementation, and it also sometimes take in consideration the social inclusion of the person. Next slide, please. So here we have a card with an overview where you can see that sadly enough only 4 member states are still using the holistic approach, and that's Cyprus, Estonia, Slovakia, and some parts of Italy, because assessment in some countries is really different from one region to another. Next slide. And then you can also see that the functional and the Barema system are sadly enough the most common used in Europe. Yes, next slide, please. So we asked the people if they were involved in their own assessment. So in the most of the countries, yes, they were directly in contact, first of all, with the doctors in most of the countries, or with a multidisciplinary team that had a questionnaire, and so they could answer by themselves. It was not based on medical attest or something else. And also some self-assessment by the person, and during the evaluation afterwards is also used in most of the countries. But it doesn't mean that there was a preparation, for example, by peer support on how you could really prepare yourself, that kind of assessment. So you were submitted directly to a questionnaire by those persons. For those who are really assertive enough, they could defend sometimes themselves, but those who couldn't was sometimes also problematic. So being there and being present wouldn't say that the outcomes of the assessment really is successful. Next slide, please. And a member state who doesn't systematically involve person with disability is surprising enough Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, Ireland, Estonia, and Luxembourg. Here is only on the request, and sometimes even some region not possible to ask to be involved directly. So they take a decision over the head of the concerned person. So it's completely not aligned with the CRPD and the motion, the nothing about us without us. Next slide, please. So when we wanted to know that how much does the European countries, the member states of it, they spend on disability based on the percentage of the GPD in 2017, we saw a big difference. For example, Malta was the one who spent it the last, and we saw that Denmark spent 5.1% of a GPD per year on persons with disabilities, on their support and on their listen. So the average on the European Union is around 2%, but yeah, the way it's spent, we don't speak about this for the moment. It's about just the amount that is spent for the disability department. Next slide, please. So this assessment is a big problem when you want to move from one member state to the other. So if you speak about the freedom of movement, the assessment is a very, very big tool that could help, but in most of the case, it's a big barrier. Because why? Because of a lack of recognition of disability assessment between the member states. So people, when they move from one country to another, and even from one region to another, you need to be reassessed. And that's a big barrier because sometimes you even have waiting lists in order to be able to be reassessed. So in the meantime, you have no access to any disability benefit or grant or support. So, and also this process, when you undertake it, when you start it, can take a long time and leave the person without any support in that meantime. And so in practices, it makes it very difficult and risky to move to another member state. And that's a big, it's not only hindering your freedom of movement, but people are thinking really very deeply before they take the risk to move from one part to another. And also persons with disabilities are being denied the right to freedom of movement because of this non-recognition of assessment for one country to another. Next slide, please. So what are the other problems that exist? I mentioned, for example, they overlook the individual needs. So like I said, there are waiting lists and sometimes it's really long. And also sometimes you have the barrier language. So even when you arrive in that country and it's up and you have an appointment, there is no translation, and sometimes they don't recognize the file that you bring with you from your own country. You need to restart everything, even if you have a disability since birth. They wanted to know everything in detail. And yeah, and sometimes invisible disabilities are easily overlooked, especially if the person cannot express himself easily. And sometimes we have overcomplicated process because, for example, I can give an example from Belgium. If you're in Brussels and you want to have a disability card to use the public transport, you need to ask at the Brussels region. You want to have it from allocation, you need to ask it for the national government. So it's quite complicated to understand. And also, it's very difficult to contest a decision when we have when they underestimate the level of your disability. So it's very difficult then again to start. So it's a big problem. Next slide, please. And also in the responses that we received, 83% of the people said that in their country, your earning affects the support you receive. So that's another big factor that push persons with disability in risk of poverty, because they look at how much you earn, and then depending on your assessment, they can reduce or increase your support allowance. And also 50% said that they have having a partner affect the level of support. So we always call it the price of love. So if you live with somebody in the house, your assessment allowance is most of the time lower than if you were living by yourself. Well, it's the same disability, but they count and they take into consideration the fact that you have a partner. In the assessment, sometimes also when they want to see what's your support need, you are married or you have a partner and he can help you at night, so you don't need assistance at night. So they reduce your hour of support. So in some countries it's really, yes, it's unfair that they mix those things. And also under 70% said that the cost of living and having children affect also the amount of support and allowance. Because again, they will say you have a close network who's there present, so it affects your assessment. Next slide, please. So a lot of problems exist. So 100% of the respondents said that information about their rights, services and financial support available to persons with disability were not easy to find and were not accessible for persons with disability. So when they are submitted in front of a questionnaire for assessment, they are not prepared enough. They don't know what they can say, what they can't say. Sometimes also they're ashamed. Sometimes you have cultural barriers. So it's really a lack of information and a lack of also services that could support the people to have a correct assessment that respect their human rights is still a big barrier. And this brings people to really live in poverty and not being included into the society. Next slide, please. So I will finish with it. If you want to know more about our report, the human rights report that EDF realized, you can download it or consult it on EDF her website. You can find it over here, and then you can see also the impact that assessment has on the daily life of person with disability, with some testimonies and also some country reports. I thank you for your attention, and I'm open for any question afterwards.
Thank you very much, Nadia. Very complete presentation, lots of interesting information. We're going to try to reconnect with, before we move on to the exploration of the situation in Cyprus and Italy, we will try to reconnect with Gunter, who was having some connection issues. If by any chance we're not able to reconnect with Gunter, we will do our best to share her presentation in another form, because I think it's very important that we listen to what Gunter has to say. So Gunter, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm here. I can hear you.
Okay, I'll hand over the floor to you, and we will cross our fingers that it will be fine this time. Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay. Can you see me? Can you hear me? Everything
Perfectly.
okay? Perfectly. I don't know why I disappeared. Sometimes it's happened in our new circumstances. So what I'd like to continue, we don't have very much time, so I can see just a bit more about the impact on a persons with disabilities when the assessment is doing not in the best way, quite poorly one. So it's a big problem because many people are unemployed, because when we have these three groups of disabilities, it means we are saying how big the percentage of ability to work those people have. And it means that some people, for example me, be very practical, have 100 inability to work. So it means I cannot speak with you now because I'm not able to work, according our Latvian assessment of disabilities. It sounds stupid, of course, but still we have that system in my country and in many other countries. The biggest problem we have at the moment, you are asking what kind of changes do we have, and if you go to the web page of our commission who made assessment of people with disabilities, you can see that there are about 5 different European projects, and all those 5 different European projects getting money to make a system better. And from one side, that's just great, but from other side, they are not changing situation in general. They are changing the situation for small pieces. And you know that you cannot change a situation for small pieces if you are not changing the framework or the frame where you put those small pieces in. So there is no really good results on it. We still have a lot of talking about remote evaluation. Do you know what means remote evaluation? It means that you can get through your assessment without meeting any people. You can prepare all your documentation, send them by mail to the commission. We still have quite a lot of doctors in a commission, but nobody else. So the doctors go through your diagnosis, medical evaluations, and say, okay, we know your diagnosis, we know your medical evaluation, you can go to second group of disability. And it goes to the very many court cases because so many people are not happy with what the commission has said. And that's quite normal, because when you can't see people, from one side, it's very comfortable not to go there, not to come to the commission, not to wait somewhere in a queue. But from other side, this only paper document work is very objective sometimes, because when you cannot see if the person can work or can't, if the person can speak normally or not, then you cannot see it and you cannot read it in the documents, you cannot make a really good decision about the person. But still, we are trying to work with it, and we have a quite good connection with our Commission of Assessment of Disabilities. We are maybe trying to them and try to explain what social model of disabilities mean. I'm not sure how many of them can understand it, but still. And the last question I'd like to speak, and Nadia just did it in a very good way when she talked about the CDF project or research made, but still there are so many small practical things again. And of course, we can speak about free movement when people try to go and live in other country. And that is great. And then you need to do a lot to go through all kind of assessments to get all kind of support what the country can provide for persons with disabilities. But when we are talking just about small mobilities, few days mobilities, it's so nice to travel around. And there are still so many problems in it. The first one is parking card. Parking card is the only one document which European Union has, which is for each country and for the persons with disabilities in each country, and which you can use in each country. So with my parking card, I can go to Belgium and use it there. But the criteria which are who can get this parking card is not made by European Union. Those criteria are made by national country. What does it mean? It means that people who are, for example, problem with heart, they cannot walk very well, they cannot breathe very well. In some countries, they do have a parking card just because they need to come closer to the door of their shop, for example. But in some countries, no. And so it means in some countries, those people can use all privileges, but in some countries, not. One more really easy and very practical thing. When you try to go to Germany, and when you try to go to the toilet, and if you are on a wheelchair, do you know what's happened? They have a special chips in the toilets only for those who have wheelchairs. And those chips can get only those people who have disabilities and who are living in Germany. So if you are not coming from Germany, you cannot go to toilet in Germany, which is accessible toilet. And then we are speaking about mobility in European Union and how nice it is to travel around. Funny, very easy, but still a big problem. Until the moment the European Union couldn't start to think about common assessment of disabilities. And okay, I know there's political will. Okay, I know that's the financial possibilities of each country, but still we need to talk more and more about possibility to have a common assessment, because otherwise we don't know even how many people with disabilities we have in the European Union, because there are so different numbers of them in different countries. Thank you so much, and thank you for possibility to continue after Nadia.
Thank you very much, Gunther. Quite a shocking presentation, and it was good to explore some of the barriers that many people overlook. I think we've heard a lot today about the need for harmonized recognition of disability assessment, so this is definitely one of the things to take away from today. Just before I move to the next speaker, I want to remind you again that you can submit your questions using the question box. So if you have any clarifications you want to hear or other topics you want to hear discussed, please put them in the question box and say to whom you would like to ask the question. Okay, now we're going to explore the specific case of 2 EU member states, Cyprus and Italy. First, we're going to go to Cyprus, so I will hand over to Konstantinos Charalambous, who's from the Department for Social Inclusion of Persons with Disabilities, Ministry of Labour, Welfare and Social Insurance in Cyprus. So, Konstantinos, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. So, in Cyprus, we use the International Classification of Functioning, Disability and Health Manual, a tool developed by the World Health Organization. ICF was selected because it is a multi-purpose tool, which includes assessment codes for clinical practice, services support, income support, education, statistics, policy, and programs. Also, due to the fact that Disabled People's International, European Disability Forum, Inclusion International, as well as many individuals with disability, were involved in the development of this tool. From the initial stages of the assessment procedure, persons with disabilities are closely involved in the process. First of all, they are required to submit annual reports from any health and rehabilitation specialists. The persons considered critical to be considered by the assessment committee. Equally important is the interview that each person has with a social worker from the department prior to their assessment in order to create a social profile with any details about the disability and everyday life of the person. During the assessment itself, the persons may be accompanied by friends or family so that a holistic assessment, they are given the time and space to fully present the problems that derive from their disability so that a holistic assessment can be made. They are given as much time and space that they deem necessary to fully present their problems that derive from their disabilities. Typically, persons wait about 1 or 2 months for their appointment to be assessed from the moment their application is received. The policy for decades was to grant financial social benefits to enable independent living and autonomy of the person. Although this policy still exists, it has been expanded to include services that provide support to persons with disabilities in other important aspects of their everyday life, such as vocational training, work, and leisure. Some weaknesses of the Cypriot model are that the network of affiliated health professionals is relatively limited, and there is often a shortage of assessors to participate in the assessment committees. This is because of the small size of Cyprus and consequently the undersupply of specific health and rehabilitation specialties like neurologists, child psychiatrists, occupational therapists, and so forth. Although the assessment committee takes into account all data regarding the history of the person and the disability, there is still the static nature of the assessment at the time of meeting with the person versus the dynamic nature of the disability. This means that the assessment sometimes may not fully capture the degree and nature of the disability. For example, the assessment may happen on a good or a bad day or period, which affects the result. Also, the individual differences of the health and rehabilitation professionals in the committee. There is no way to standardize the perceptions, behaviors, and individual styles or background of the health professionals, a fact that sometimes may favor some individuals and may prove detrimental to others. There are, of course, the strengths of the model. The scientific nature of the tool of ICF, as well as its multidisciplinary approach, make it easier to have a coding for each factor, which is the same for everyone. It provides a common language for the different disciplines to refer to the same issues. The use of protocols ensures that there is a high degree of objectivity in measuring the various aspects of the disability. The human approach adopted by the committees, which is achieved by giving the persons as much time as possible to express aspects of their disability which are unique to them. The assessment procedures and the whole assessment mechanism developed by the department through the use of this tool ensures a strong degree of objectivity, fairness, and equality in the assessment results and consequent decisions on persons' rights for social benefits and services. Under the responsibility of my department and my ministry, there is a series of social benefits and services provided to persons with disabilities, ensuring a satisfactory standard of living with dignity and with basic support services. This is not to say that there is no room for improvement, far from it. Consultations with the organizations of persons with disabilities are continuous, and there are always demands put forth by the organizations or suggestions by the public services to consult and develop further measures. That is basically what the situation in Cyprus is pertaining to the assessment of persons with disabilities. A holistic approach is attempted by the use of many tools, by the use of many health professionals from different backgrounds, not just medical professionals, but also rehabilitation professionals. That is all I have to say about that. I am open to questions. I would be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Konstantinos. Very good timekeeping as well. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. It was a very honest presentation, I think, talking about Cyprus's holistic approach, but also being open about some of the remaining challenges you have. So yes, as Konstantinos mentioned, please feel free to address any questions to him directly in the questions box. Okay, and now we will move on to our final speaker for today, who will be talking about the situation in Italy. This is Giampiero Greffo. And seeing as we're running a little bit short of time, Giampiero, I will hand straight over to you. The floor is yours. Giampiero, I think you're muted.
Hi, Giampiero. Maybe you can, it's Raquel. Maybe you can try to, yes. Just try to connect again the headphones. We can't hear you.
Hello.
Oh, now we can hear you, Giampiero.
Okay. Good morning, all. Thank you for invitation. Next slide, please. My presentation starts from the first issue is that in all European Union countries, the Convention of Rights of Persons with Disability is not applied on the definition of person with disability. That is the first issue because in general, the country not taking account that is the society that disabling person. Next step, and that means that in the different countries the legislation are based on the medical model, and this produce that next time a very negative issue, because the barème system for diagnosis medical condition no produce a concrete explication about the situation, because the country are very different situation on the society, on the economic and social, and what kind of barrier person receive from society. And the second issue is that this system is very old, are developed after the First War, and after 1 century we need to change concretely that. Change again slide. It's evident that this approach take in account only the health condition and forget the other condition, that the interaction with the other issue. This means the evaluation are limited. Next slide. Next slide. In Italy, we're working to overcoming this limit because the basic system of barème are inadequate, and we try to distinguish from the 92 the condition of invalidity based on the idea of the functional limitation, on the condition of handicap. In this period are not the ICF. This produced 2 assessments. The first only based on the medical approach, the second are based on a more holistic approach. It's evident that in this kind of framework, there are some contradictions. Please, slide. The second level assessment are necessary to understanding exactly what is the support for the different rights. If I speak about the work, I can speak that the expertise is physician. If I speak about education, it's the same. If I speak the social support, is the same. This means we try to developing a system to 2 levels of the assessment. Next slide. Next. For example, in the employment, we try to understanding that what is the kind of barrier of the difficult person with disability living when go to work, and that produce a functional system of evaluation to identify, in one hand, the condition of person with disability in the capacity, and the other hand, what is the framework of the work that person living. Next. It's evident that this situation take in account more the interaction with the person and the activity. It's evident that this system needs to be monitoring frequently, because the system to work can change, and the person with disability need to be adapted action to favorize the inclusion. Next. This action happen in different areas. Happen in education, because the education issue are considered a characteristic that need to be evaluated by the educational system. You know, in Italy, only the person with disability go in ordinary setting. This means that in the society, the school is a very core value system and functioning for all tissue. Unfortunately, all the activity and the assessment are limited frequently to an idea that produce a strong stigma of person with disability. When I explain about the assessment, if the assessment is only on the health, for example, thinking you on the residential care, this means that the person are not supported. remain segregate, remain exactly a person that receive hard level of the negative issue. The experience of the COVID-19 show us this person, if are evaluated in a different form, this person receive appropriate support. In my point of view, the question is to moving for a social protection scheme that are based practically on old vision to a social inclusion scheme, because persons with disability need to be supported in participation, need to be supported in activity, and so on. Next, please. All the benefit that the person receive in Italy, they are the different issue at the national and regional level, are related to assessment. The assessment are not based only on an evaluation of the person, but need to be able to identify what kind of support person need to be received. Next. We have in the program of the government in disability an idea to change the assessment system on the basis of the ICF and the CRPD. Next. A recent research in Umbria made by my organization identify what is the assessment appropriate and the support appropriate for independent living. Next. And the idea is that we need to use the determinant of the life. Frequently, we have the determinant of the health, the determinant of education, but we forget that the conventions say that we need to speak about all the life. For that, we identify 3 areas of assessment. The first area is the mode of functioning of the person. Not only the condition of limitation identified, for example, I am a polio, I live in a wheelchair, but this activity need to be identified as I function, as I can have an empowerment of my capacity, as I can have a resilience in the life, I can adapt my capacity to my life. The second point are related to analysis of attitude of family. In the determinant of life, family are a very important issue. And the family frequently don't believe on the person, have only a protective vision and the activity that no support the participation frequently. Third level is the profile of the community where I live. And that is another issue because my condition of disability, depending exactly for how I am empowered, how I living in my family and I can go out of my family, how the society can help me to support overcoming barrier, discrimination, and obstacle. Next. It's evident that this is based on personalized project. Personalized project means that the person are the more expert of themselves. The person need to be supported to overcoming the condition of disability they receive from society. And frequently we need to introduce new professional profile, like peer counselor, the person that favorize autonomy, self-determination, independency, and interindependency. It's evident that this process is this program, personalized project is progressive, need to be monitoring frequently and understand is how I can achieve some result, what is the next step to support. Next. Next. It's evident that the change of definition are related to change of assessment. For that, one of the main issues that the organization need to do is exactly to fighting for change definition in the legislation, because this happen only in some country, frequently country that introduce the convention as the new legislation, like Morocco, and present this country try to identify new form of assessment. For that, I think, and thank you for your listen me, that that is the goals, to change system of definition of person with disability, to change the assessment system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giampiero. Again, a very interesting and detailed presentation. We can now move on to some of the questions we've received. Some of the questions are simply practical ones, so I can already answer this for you. We had a question about whether the webinars will be made available later. We will make the recording of this webinar available on our website. As you can imagine, at the moment, we're doing quite a few webinars. So on the EDF website, we now have quite a rich archive of different webinars. I would invite you to check it out and see if there are webinars there that interest you in particular. Regarding a question regarding the PowerPoint presentations, whether they can be shared. For Nadia's presentation, I know that won't be a problem, and we can of course ask Giampiero if we can also share that, and we can email that out to the participants. Then questions that we've received. We have a question for Mark. Mark, this question for you is, do you have any concerns about the use of ICF, so the International Classification of Functioning, in the assessment process, or recommendations for its use? Mark, would you be happy to answer that?
Sure. I think it's a really good question, and in fact, it's one that Catalina and I were discussing. Yeah, it's complex. You know, we need to understand that as instruments, the CRPD and the ICF serve very different functions. You know, one is a prescriptive human rights instrument, sets out a normative framework. The ICF is a descriptive classification system. You know, it's a taxonomy, you know, a glossary of terms. It is intended, well, as a glossary, it's intended to be value neutral. You know, it's not equivalent. It's not a model of disability. I mean, there is a model which underpins it, but really it's just a combination of models. We know that a lot of states are kind of drawing on the language or the methods that have come out of the ICF framework. I don't think we should see that as necessarily contradictory with a social model or a human rights-based approach. I think we have to be really clear that an assessment system should be driven by the normative framework of the human rights instrument, the CRPD, and kind of animated also by a social model focus on barriers as well as persons. Where the ICF could be of some use is in providing us with a technical language to describe characteristics of persons, characteristics of environments, barriers, transport, whatever. You know, it has some utility in that way. So I wouldn't see it as contradictory. I would just see it as operating on a completely different level.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark, for that response. I hope that answered your question, whoever submitted that. I have another question for, well, I should say also we received many comments praising the speakers and the quality of the intervention, so I should just point this out as well. I have a question for Catalina Devandas, if you're happy to respond. To what extent do you think the COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis this is leading to will affect the likelihood of persons with disabilities in Europe getting the social support they require after receiving their disability assessment? It's quite a big question. Would you be happy to answer this, Catalina?
Yes, sure. If I'm able to open my webcam. Yes, also a very good question, and I was wondering how we were so far able to avoid discussing the COVID since we have been immersed in this set of seminars for the whole month. But yes, I do think that there are risks, and there are important risks that we need to be aware of. We very recently have received information on decisions being made about of course, budgetary cuts, funds that will be reassigned to cover COVID-related expenses, and that some of those suggestions to reduce budgetary lines were on assistive devices and technology for persons with disabilities, for instance. So yes, I do think that it will have an impact, and that we need to be very vigilant to avoid having those negative outcomes for persons with disabilities. And on the contrary, one of the most important things that has come very clearly out in the recommendations prepared by my mandate, by WHO, by the Secretary General in his recently launched policy brief on the COVID and persons with disabilities, is actually the need to strengthen the social security, the social protection systems, to make sure that the whole set of support networks and services for persons with disabilities are in place. One of the biggest challenges of this process has been the disruption of the support networks and services for persons with disabilities, and it's a lesson learned on how do we need to invest in the recovery responses and the building back better packages to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes that we are seeing. I mean, the impact and the disproportionate impact that this crisis is having is also due to some of the bad policy responses for persons with disabilities, including the response on institutionalization, for instance. So we really need to make sure that as a sector, and I will be vocal for the remaining part of my mandate on that, the consequences for those that have been the most impacted would not be double by limiting budget and limiting options for persons with disabilities to access to the support they need. That will probably increase after this crisis or during the response and recovery of this crisis. Thank you.
I can say something.
Yes, Giampiero, feel free to jump in. Yes.
Yes. No, my concern is that in Europe, the health of the diet for the COVID coming in the residential institution. That is a thing that show that the protect system not protect in reality. That is one of the issue. Frequently thinking that the protection is to close people in a segregation setting. In reality, the real protection is when the person remain at home, receive the appropriate support, and the community that they live protect this person from much risk. In my point of view, this is one of the questions that is evident in the COVID. If the COVID touching person that are close in segregate setting, no protect this person, the system. If the person with the same budget, this means in Italy a budget is from 4,050 to 6,000 euro per month, this kind of the money can be used to support the participation of the person in their life, in their community at home. And that's produce more capacity, not only to self-determination, but in the same time to self-protection. This is exactly one of the issues when I speak about the social scheme based on the protection need to be changed in a social scheme based on inclusion.
Very good point. Thank you very much, Giampiero. I would just, as we're running a little bit out of time, I would just like to ask or look for a sign from our sign language interpreters and our captioner to go just a few minutes over. Thank you very much, Ferdinand. We just have a few questions left, and they're good questions, so I think it would be a shame not to answer them. I have a question here for Nadia. It says, one interesting topic in many countries is whether the disability assessment should be done by the same committee that does the assessment for personal assistance. Nadia, would you be happy to comment on this?
Can you please repeat the question? Sorry, I was...
Let me read it out so I make sure I don't make a mistake. One interesting topic in many countries is whether the disability assessment should be done by the same committee with the assessment for personal assistance. Does this?
Yes, because the assessment for personal assistance really would enlighten the support need that the person need to be included in society. And that's something far away from the medical model, and it can really help the people to live really inclusive within the society. I think it's a good idea, it's a good directive to go in that direction.
Thank you, Nadia. I have a question also for Konstantinos Charalambous. Have you seen any notable improvements in recent years in Cyprus, or has it become more difficult for persons with disabilities to get the support they need? Did the financial crisis have any effect on this? Would you be happy to answer this, Konstantinos?
Yes. In fact, after 2013, when the crisis hit Cyprus, there has been some, there was a bit of a stagnancy in the whole economy, but through this model, we were able to create many programs that target different areas of the persons with disabilities. For example, we have created programs that provide support for people with disabilities to find work and receive support during their employment. We have programs that provide social assistance to persons who require them in whatever area of their life. We have created legislation that enables people with disabilities to find work in the public sector. I think that things in Cyprus are improving. And not of course, they are not perfect, but people with disabilities are no longer isolated and confined to their homes. They have the freedom to explore other areas of their lives which are important, such as employment or leisure, vocational training to open up opportunities for employment. Of course, there is room for improvement, but overall, there is a holistic approach regarding the provision of support services, economic benefits, and otherwise support in carrying on with their everyday lives.
Thank you very much. A very complete answer. We have two more questions. Both of them are for Mark. So, Mark, the first question for you says, how does disability assessment affect disability statistics in EU countries? And does the medical understanding reduce the number of registered persons with disabilities?
Oh, big question. Yes, yeah, in some ways it does, in some ways it doesn't. Certainly, if you take the administrative status that is awarded to people through process of assessment, that gives them a category of a disabled person, which happens in some member states, then you're going to have huge differences in that respect. Not all of the member states do classify people as disabled or not disabled. So there would be many ways you would measure that. I mean, you could look at the number of people who receive any kind of disability cash benefit for additional costs or out of work. Those numbers are a little bit more consistent in terms of estimates, but to be honest, when we try to make estimates, we don't use this basis. It's on the basis of self-reporting, which is problematic also and produces big variations between countries. But the data that is in the surveys is not based on administrative assessments of disability. Sorry, did I miss a question?
No, I'm going to deliver your final question, which I think is possibly as challenging, although I suspect there might be a very short answer to it, which is, do you think there is a system in any country or region that we could confidently describe as being compliant with the CRPD?
I doubt it. I mean, the report which Lisa Waddington led that we did, and in the paper that we've been writing since that, which is not yet published, what we tried to do is to pull out sort of examples of promising practices, which is how we normally work. You know, no one system is going to work in all respects, but there will always be elements of promising practice. You know, in most countries, there will be some element of promising practice, you know, whether that's about drawing on different disciplinary expertise. It's interesting the changes in Malta, for example, with bringing in a disability and human rights perspective, you know, into the framing of the assessments process, and certainly the training of staff. Yeah. I don't think you could point to one and say do it like that.
Thank you very much. Okay, and on that note, I think we will bring the webinar to a close. So I would like to again thank all of our speakers, Catalina Devandas, Mark Priestley, Gunther Ancher, Nadia Haddad, Konstantinos Charalambous, and Giampiero Griffo. I would like to, of course, thank our international sign language interpreters, Ferdinand and Lisa, and our captioner, Kimberly, especially as we went a little bit over time. And I would also like to thank my colleagues Raquel Riaza and Marine Ultri for their support during the webinar. And again, thank you all for joining. I hope it was interesting, and at some point in the near future, we will put the recording of the webinar up on our website, so you can look out for that. Thank you all very much, and have a nice day.